Just to begin, in terms of the context, there is an ongoing international armed conflict on the territory of Palestine and has been. And what I'm focusing here when I say international armed conflict, it is in that area of Palestine that we call the occupied Palestinian territories. Those parts of Palestine that have now been occupied for going into 58 years, arising out of the 1967 war. So we are talking about the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, as well as the Gaza Strip. It is actually not, 2 points are not contested by anyone maybe than one of the parties to this conflict. And that is that all of the territory that I mentioned, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, as well as the Gaza Strip, are occupied as a matter of international law. This has been reaffirmed again and again by the United Nations Security Council, most recently in a more explicit way in Security Council Resolution 2334 in 2016, though that is far from the only or even the latest Security Council resolution to recognize the occupation of the entirety of those territories that I mentioned. The General Assembly, again, has repeatedly recognized the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, as occupied, as well as the Gaza Strip. And the reason I'm emphasizing this is Israel has said that when it disengaged from Gaza in 2005, it no longer is in a position of occupation. And I think what the last 19 months in particular have shown, but frankly, the prior 17, 18, 19 years also demonstrated, as Gaza was under a situation of blockade and closure, is that Israel always had effective control over the ports of entry and exit from Gaza, the freedom of movement of the Palestinian population, control over the territorial sea borders and airspace, and these are some of the indicators of occupation under international law. And East Jerusalem, Israel has declared and tried to extend its law to East Jerusalem in 1980, and the Security Council said that that does not change the legal status of Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, as occupied territory. And of course, there have also been a number of UN bodies, including commissions of inquiry, fact-finding missions, UN special procedures that all recognize the status of occupation. And the second thing I would say is not contested as a matter of law is that occupation is a form of international armed conflict. And so, regardless of what might be also happening alongside the occupation, with crimes being committed on the territory of Israel, for example, that does not change the status of the situation of Palestine being one of international armed conflict, and that therefore the full weight of international armed conflict applying and the full scope and scale of the laws of occupation applying. We've also had the International Court of Justice recognize the fact that these territories are occupied. And I will mention later on the very, very important decision that came out from the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, in July 2024, when it issued an extensive advisory opinion on the legality, or as it concluded, the illegality of Israel's continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory. So to come up with the conclusion that Israel's continued presence in that territory is unlawful, it had as a precondition to find that these territories, Gaza, West Bank, East Jerusalem, are in fact occupied. And as I mentioned at the start, when I said that we're not just going to be looking at Israel's legal obligations under international law. These ICJ decisions, Security Council resolutions, and what we can determine to be customary international law because of the consensus. This is binding, therefore, on all states parties to all states, not just states parties. There are some obligations that flow to the signatories of the Geneva Conventions or the Genocide Convention, and then there are other obligations that exist for all states because of the nature of the way international law works. So once we are in a situation of a armed conflict, and again, in this case, I would say it's an international armed conflict to the extent that that distinction still matters. And I appreciate what Chantal said, that we shouldn't overemphasize this distinction at this point in time. But what that means that we're in an armed conflict is that the Geneva Conventions apply, the Hague regulations apply, and the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court, Article 8, laying out war crimes. These all apply. And the reason, when we're talking about Palestine, that that last instrument applies is because the state of Palestine is a member of the International Criminal Court. It joined the court in 2014, giving jurisdiction, it joined, on the 1st of January 2015, giving jurisdiction back to June 2014. And a member state of the ICC gives jurisdiction over two things to the ICC, the International Criminal Court, over its territory and over its nationals. So if a crime is committed on the territory of the state of Palestine, the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction. And that territory, going back to what I just laid out, is the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, as well as the Gaza Strip. And nationals would be nationals of the state of Palestine. So that means if a Palestinian commits a crime on the territory of another state, including Israel, that person can be brought before the ICC, even though Israel is not a member state of the ICC. One last point that I'm not sure was said in the first two presentations, but the implications, again, for other states when there is a situation of armed conflict as signatories to the Geneva Conventions and the Genocide Convention for that matter, is that per Article 1 of those treaties, those conventions, states that are a signatory to the conventions have an obligation not only to respect the provisions of the Geneva Conventions or the Genocide Convention, but also to ensure respect. So that obligation means to ensure that no other state is violating the protections laid out in the Geneva Conventions or the Genocide Convention. When it comes to the Genocide Convention, that has been understood to be a duty to prevent the commission of genocide, not just an after the fact obligation, but a obligation to take all measures that a state can take once they are on notice of a serious risk of genocide being committed. And likewise for the Geneva Conventions, ensuring respect means that when you are on notice that there is a violation of the Geneva Conventions as a signatory, which pretty much means all states, you have an obligation to make sure that the offending state ceases that violation. So the protections for the Palestinian population, and I'll be honest, giving this presentation at this moment with the situation that we see in Gaza, it feels a little bit surreal to be laying out these protections when we see them in such gross violation on a day-to-day, month-to-month, and now year-to-year basis. But all states are obligated then to do what they can to stop these violations. Now, we're in this module talking about violations of international humanitarian law or the law of armed conflict. And of course, the Hague Regulations and Geneva Conventions are the backbone of IHL. But in the context of armed conflict, we don't only have the commission of war crimes, we also can have other crimes committed here. And these include two key categories of crimes. The first is crimes against humanity. So crimes against humanity also came out of the post-World War II Nuremberg era and the recognition that there are some crimes that are so egregious that they concern all of us and are really crimes not just against the victims, but against humanity. And the innovation of, or the one of the key steps of the Yugoslav and Rwandan tribunals that was codified then in the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court is to recognize that crimes against humanity can apply in times of armed conflict as well as in times of peace. So just for this audience, again, I know we're talking about the situation of armed conflict, but it's important to recognize that crimes against humanity can also be a tool in the toolbox of accountability in times not of armed conflict. But here, talking about the situation in Palestine, I will get into some of the specific crimes against humanity that could be applicable and why this is an additional or should be an additional protection to the Palestinian population. So, what are crimes against humanity? They are a series of underlying acts that are committed on a widespread or systematic basis, directed against a civilian population. So it's either because of the number of crimes that are being committed, the number of victims that are being created because of this criminal conduct, or the systematic nature, meaning you're seeing the same thing happen neighborhood after neighborhood, or detention center after detention center. You're seeing that there's something systematic in the way that the criminal conduct is being committed. And what you then also see, and what is codified in the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court, is that there is a course of conduct pursuant to a state or an organizational policy. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to have written down a policy, but it could be one that is announced or one that can be inferred from, again, seeing that course of conduct in neighborhood after neighborhood or detention center after detention center. And a couple of the examples of crimes against humanity are murder and extermination, and also forcible transfer or deportation. And in the context of occupation, that can also be a war crime, and that could be moving a population out of their occupied territory or moving the population of the occupying force into a territory. We'll talk a little bit more as we go down the list of actual crimes being committed in Palestine onto crimes against humanity. But I think that this is particularly important because unlike the law of occupation and the law of armed conflict, which applies to the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, the crimes against humanity can extend to crimes committed against all Palestinians. So that could be Palestinians inside the Green Line in Israel who are being discriminated against in a widespread or systematic way because they are Palestinians, and that is the crime against humanity of persecution, or it could be the crime against humanity of apartheid. And this could also be Palestinians who are in the diaspora. Palestinians who, because they are Palestinians, are not allowed to cross checkpoint or a crossing to get in to the West Bank, to fly into Tel Aviv to get to see family in Jerusalem. So I think that this crime against humanity overlay with other provisions of international law that are specific to armed conflict are particularly appropriate to think about in the context of Palestine. And then, of course, the other very, very serious crime that also can occur during times of peace or times of war is the crime of genocide. And so, what we saw, for example, in the former Yugoslavia tribunal, there were many cases that dealt with crimes against humanity and war crimes, and those carry some very serious and long sentences. So I don't want to diminish the seriousness of the commission of war crimes or crimes against humanity. But what we also saw the ICTY, the Yugoslav Tribunal, find is that when it came to the enclave of Srebrenica, that specific area wasn't only a crime against humanity, it wasn't only a war crime, but when the Bosnian Serbs surrounded the Bosnian Muslim population, separated the boys and men from the women, children, and elderly, bussed the women and children out, and then put the men on a forced march where they killed 8,000 Bosnian men and boys over the period of a week in July 1995. They didn't say this is simply forcible transfer or murder. They said that this is genocide because that conduct was seeking to destroy in whole or in part a specific population, the Bosnian Muslim population in that eastern part of Bosnia. And it was done with the intent to destroy. And that intent in that case was inferred by the conduct of the Bosnian Serbs. As we'll talk about with the situation currently in Gaza, we have far more overt admissions of what the plan is for the Palestinian population. But I mentioned Srebrenica both because I think it's a chapter of history that is getting forgotten, and it is also a very powerful precedent to look at. The men and boys deserved protection, even though they were men and boys of military age, even though some of them may have had weapons as weak in contrast to the Bosnian Serbs as they were. The War Crimes Tribunal found that they still deserved the protections of international law. They deserved to be protected from the commission of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, be that targeted for destruction or otherwise not treated in accordance with the means and methods of approved warfare. So the idea that a population as a whole, or even a segment of the population, like the male population between the ages of, I don't know, 12 and 80, can be targeted is something that we have very clear jurisprudence that international law is supposed to protect them from. But I also want to note that there is one other crime that we haven't really discussed here today that's also in the Rome Statute, and that is the crime of aggression. And the crime of aggression certainly is relevant to a discussion of armed conflict. The crime of aggression, known during the Nuremberg trials as the crime against peace, this was at that point seen as the crime of crimes. This is a violation of the UN Charter, where armed force of one state is used against the sovereignty or territorial integrity of another state. It can be through invasion or attempts at annexation. So there are different challenges at this point in time of actually enforcing the prohibition on aggression. It is something that, because of Russia's actions in Ukraine and particularly around Crimea, there has been a fair amount of focus in the last few years about really increasing enforcement and potentially even building a separate tribunal to deal with this crime. But I think it's also one that is very, very relevant to the discussion of Palestine. With that background and just maybe a footnote to everything I've said as I look at my notes, Palestine has had non-member observer state status at the UN since November 2012. So that was a precursor to joining the ICC as a member state, and it's also something that's relevant to take into account when thinking about the crime of aggression. So some of the representative crimes that we're seeing committed at this moment, literally, in the occupied Palestinian territory, we're going to go through those. And I'm going to do something that is not I tried to think how not to do this, because when I'm going to talk about Gaza on the one hand and the West Bank and East Jerusalem on the other. And I want to just acknowledge that in so doing, I am in ways replicating the very fragmentation of the Palestinian territory and people that is part of, I think, the plan for Palestine and erasing Palestine. I'm going to do this more divided analysis when it comes to war crimes and genocide, even more than crimes against humanity, because I do think that that's a place where one can put a more holistic analysis on the crimes being committed in Palestine. And even again, as I do this division between Gaza and the West Bank, I also want to emphasize that what we're seeing is that what happens in Gaza often migrates to the West Bank and Jerusalem. So it's it I'm laying it out in this way in part because of the factual reality at the moment, and in part because of the way it enables or assists in seeing the analysis of crimes. But again, a disclaimer that this is in no way intended to reinforce the fragmentation or division of a unified Palestinian territory or state of Palestine. And likewise, a disclaimer at the start, as I look at Gaza in particular, the criminal conduct did not begin in Gaza after the October 7th attacks. There had been a closure on Gaza in place since soon after Hamas was elected. So there was about a 17-year closure by the time October 7th happened. And this means a denial of a range of rights to Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, 2.1 million people or 2.2 million people. We don't have exact numbers, who were denied access to freedom of movement, freedom of education, freedom of family unification, really a crime against humanity of persecution over the course of that blockade, that Israel again was exercising effective control over entry, exit, and the territorial space of Gaza. And over the course of the decade or so prior, there had also been a number of military assaults on Gaza. I remember back in late 2008, early 2009, with so-called Operation Cast Lead, the world was shocked to see a military offensive against a closed Gaza Strip that led to many, many civilians being killed. And again, at that point, even a high percentage of children being killed. That led to the Goldstone Commission, a fact-finding mission, and calls for accountability, calls for an end to the occupation, calls for an end at minimum to the blockade. None of that happened. And so we saw in summer 2014 a 51-day military offensive named Operation Protective Edge, where again, civilians were killed in very large numbers across the Gaza Strip. Civilians who should have all of the protections of IHL that we heard laid out by the first two panelists today, the first two faculty today. And That didn't happen, nor did the accountability happen. So there were precursors building up to what we saw happen today. And of course, there was the attack on the Great March of Return, a non-violent, peaceful call for resistance and return in the Gaza Strip, where protesters instead were shot and killed. And that led to yet another UN Commission of Inquiry. So the crimes have not started, did not begin on October 8th, but we are in a moment of just unprecedented cruelty and harm across the entire Gaza Strip. So what we've seen in the since October 2023, at least 53,000 people have been killed, of whom at least 16,000 are children, 8,300 are women. It is estimated that 1,400 healthcare workers have been killed and at least 213 journalists. One of the things that I think we all have to remember with these numbers is that there are so many people who remain buried under the rubble. There are a lot of people who it's not known if they're in detention in an Israeli prison or if they are dead. So these numbers are estimates. They're shocking, but they are most certainly not as high as they ultimately will be. 120,000 people have been wounded. Literally, millions have been subjected to forced evacuations, where the population was told from the north to move south, from the south to move north, move down to Rafah, move over to Khan Yunis. So repeated internal displacements of most of the population of Gaza, with many people now reporting 6, 7, 8 times being forcibly transferred within the Gaza Strip. The civilian destruction is widespread of schools, homes, religious institutions, bakeries, which provide needed food, infrastructure destroyed. The list goes on. One the part that I think is most notable to reference is 40% of hospitals have been destroyed, with the remaining left partially functioning. It's worth anyone who's listening to this and interested in more of the facts to seek out some of the testimonies and interviews given by doctors who got into Gaza and worked alongside extremely brave Palestinian medical professionals. They are among the few who've been able to go in and out, and that's been increasingly difficult, but have been able to bear witness and share information about what they saw. So with these numbers that I've given you, which reflect human beings and their homes and their lives and their histories, we have a number of war crimes that have been committed. So beginning with willful killing, which is a grave breach of the Geneva Conventions. And as our two professors told us, grave breaches are really the highest level of crimes, meaning that they should have the highest level of enforcement to prevent them and punish them when they occur. They trigger universal jurisdiction. We've also seen torture. And whether it's the prisoners who we saw stripped and blindfolded and with their hands tied up in Gaza, or the many who are disappeared and then families eventually find out that their loved one was detained in an Israeli prison. The number of people in detention who are being tortured is at a very, very high level. And here I would point to Palestinian organizations like Adamir, which are doing incredible work under very difficult conditions, or the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, which just put out a devastating report last week on torture. Other crimes, and that is a grave breach. And here, doctors are not immune from being detained and tortured. And Dr. Abu Safia is a case in point. This is someone who many of us came to know from his interviews with Western media, and then now he is detained and in in increasingly grave danger. We've also had willfully causing great suffering or injury to body or health, another grave breach, widespread. I gave the number of 120,000 who are injured. The willfully causing great suffering or injury, this also includes mental harm. And the statistics out of UNICEF on the situation for children in Gaza is devastating. I would also highlight the incredible and painful work done by Defense for Children International Palestine in continuing to tell the story and the lives of Palestinian children who are killed and injured, and the mental impact that what has been going on over these many months, which we all can see, is having on the next generation. Other war crimes include extensive destruction of property not justified by military necessity and carried out unlawfully and wantonly. This is one where we hear a lot, and especially in the early weeks, we're hearing a lot about military necessity and really looking at, was this building, was there a target, a military target in it, or in that one? I think it's important to go back to what our first professor told us about military necessity. That analysis needs to be done before a strike, and it needs to be done in accordance with the practices that are recognized under IHL. And if one were to look through the jurisprudence of the Yugoslav War Crimes Tribunal and look at how military necessity was assessed there compared to what we are hearing it should be assessed in this context, there's no resemblance. There's very little resemblance because the idea of military necessity has been able to swallow up the prohibition. And I would suggest that rather than looking at an incident by incident basis, one has to look across the entirety of the Gaza Strip, where you are seeing time and time and time and time and time again that the use of a 2-ton bomb, a 2,000-pound bomb, a bunker busting bomb, drone helicopters that are strafing entire refugee displaced tent camps, and seeing that the results are the death of children in such high numbers who are clearly not participating in hostilities in any way as children. They are protected persons of the highest order, journalists, the same, doctors and medical professionals, the same. There's something very off in the analysis if these kinds of killings are somehow deemed to be justifiable. Other grave breaches of war crimes, and again, I'll move more quickly through this, include unlawful transfer and deportation. I mentioned about the continual forced evacuations and displacements. And of course, now there are also not homes to go back to. 92% of the housing units have been destroyed or damaged. OCHA, UN Office of Humanitarian Affairs, is an excellent resource that continually puts out updates on statistics on everything from access to drinking water to access to food supplies to number of schools or places of worship that have been destroyed. So that's where I'm taking these statistics from. And again, it's 92% of housing units destroyed or damaged, with more than 1.1 million people in need of emergency shelter. Hostage taking is also a grave breach. And I think just to supplement to what Chantal said about the ICC arrest warrants, not only were arrest warrants sought and granted for Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Minister of Defense Gallant, but they were also sought for 3 senior Hamas officials. 2 of them were killed, assassinated, before the arrest warrants could be ruled on. And then the third case, even when it was issued, but that person is also killed. So there were arrest warrants sought that included the taking of hostages on October 7th, but none of those cases at this point, at least the ones that we know arrest warrants were sought, will make it to trial because all of the would be defendants were killed. But I think we also need to think about the taking of hostages in the broader sense, and this could also be those who were captured in Gaza and taken to detention centers in Israel without charge. Again, not knowing who or where they were taken. Chantal spoke about intentionally using starvation of civilians as a method of warfare. This is one of the war crimes that is part of the arrest warrant that was issued already in November. Now, since the issuance of that arrest warrant, we went through a period where there was a brief ceasefire, and that ceasefire was breached. And then we were in a period of 11 weeks again of complete blockade where no food got in. And the warnings out of the United Nations over these last 11 weeks have been as dire as they can be. And today, for the first time, it was applauded that 9 trucks got in. Now, thankfully, 9 trucks got in, but that is not what you need when you have a population where UN has found that literally 100% of the population face high levels of acute food insecurity. Over 1 million people face emergency levels of food insecurity, and 470,000 people are facing catastrophic levels of food insecurity. So 470,000 Palestinians in Gaza at this moment are in a state of food insecurity, despite there being arrest warrants for this war crime of intentionally using starvation. There are a number of other war crimes that are relevant to take into account. Particularly, I would highlight intentionally directing attacks against buildings dedicated to religion, education, art, science, hospitals, etc. At this point, 2,300 education facilities from kindergartens to universities have been destroyed or damaged, including 57 university buildings. Approximately 80% of Gaza's mosques have been destroyed, including the 1,400-year-old Great Omari Mosque, and 3 churches, including the third oldest church in the world, have been destroyed. So these are war crimes. This is conduct that has been put in the Geneva Conventions that should not be happening. I would just recall that the purpose of these laws of armed conflict, what I call the international humanitarian law, it is to be protective. It is not to give green lights for all kinds of conduct in war. Rather, it's supposed to curtail and contain the means and methods of war to protect civilian populations. And what we are seeing in Gaza is that more often in the political discourse, it's being weaponized to justify and excuse attacks on civilian population, civilian infrastructure, and frankly, the entire population. I want to touch on the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, for war crimes that are being committed there. What we've seen is a very, very serious uptick in what was already a very, very difficult and bad, increasingly bad situation across the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Here, the biggest trends that we're seeing is killings, home demolitions, mass arrests, and settler violence. So before you have settler violence, you have the movement of settlers into the occupied territory. And so that is a violation, again, of the Geneva Conventions of transfer of your population into the occupier's population into an occupied territory. And we've seen Palestinians transferred out, refused reentry, having their documents rendered invalid. We've also seen pillage of natural resources, and pillage is a war crime. I will touch briefly on crimes against humanity. Again, what I said earlier about crimes against humanity, in part because they can apply in times of armed conflict and in times of peace, and also because of what are recognized as as crimes against humanity. I think that this is a particularly useful lens for taking a more holistic view of the crimes being committed across the Palestinian territory, the occupied Palestinian territory, and against Palestinians, whether those in Palestine or those in the diaspora. When we are looking at Gaza, we have the crime against humanity of murder, the crime against humanity of forcible transfer, and I'm just mentioning a couple, and the crime against humanity of extermination. Extermination includes the intentional infliction of conditions of life, and this includes deprivation of access to food, medicine, that is calculated to bring about the destruction of part of a population. So what I detailed above, we have the food insecurity situation in Gaza, and this is not a coincidence. This is not a result of a humanitarian disaster. This is the result of a promise made by senior Israeli officials in the days right after the October 7th attacks to impose a total siege on Gaza, where it was said no food, no fuel, no electricity, no water. So this was the creation of conditions of life that we have seen that declaration, that promise carried out over these 19 months as humanitarian assistance, as first of all, Palestinians being denied the ability to grow food themselves, to feed themselves, to be self-sufficient. But then after creating these conditions where there is continual bombardment, forced movement, displacement, and terror, what we're seeing is that the humanitarian assistance is being denied. 90% of households are experiencing water insecurity, and this is in part because of what the infrastructure that was bombed early on in this military assault, so that access to clean drinking water is not a given. And nearly a million children, as I mentioned, are in need of mental health and psychosocial support. When it comes to the West Bank, deportation and forcible transfer, again, out and in are two of the key features that we see. Imprisonment, the widespread use of administrative detention, where Palestinians are detained without charge on suspicion, held for months at a time, renewable months at a time without charges, which can turn into years at a time. So the situation of Palestinian prisoners and Palestinian political prisoners is again at record high numbers. And alongside that, we are seeing an uptick in torture. And then another crime against humanity that I think is relevant to the West Bank, to Gaza, and to all areas of historic Palestine is the crime of apartheid. And this is where you're imposing two different legal regimes, two different sets of laws and protections based on who someone is. And that is a crime against humanity that is very much related to another crime against humanity of persecution, which is the denial of fundamental rights to a group because of who they are. So it's a discrimination-based crime, and those fundamental rights could be the right to movement, education, life, freedom from torture, family reunification, practice of your religion. So things that have been recognized across the human rights regime can be underlying acts of persecution. And then all of some of these crimes that I've mentioned as crimes against humanity ultimately build into the crime of genocide when you have the intent. So genocide is the intent to destroy in whole or in part a population based on maybe nationality, religion, ethnicity, race, destroy that population as such. So it's not simply that you have a large number of casualties or victims out of a population, but it's that they are being targeted for destruction as such. And if you look at the underlying acts of crimes against humanity of extermination and murder, those are two of the underlying acts of genocide. So killing is an underlying act, as is creating conditions of life to destroy a group in whole or in part. So the line between where something is extermination and where it turns to genocide really turns on intent. And again, we've had those. So now we'll come to enforcement. So looking at enforcement, I'll hit two sides: against whom and where. So based on the framework that's been laid out, the first level, and it not necessarily in a hierarchy, but the first where maybe you could have the most protection if there were actual enforcement, is against states. States have the duty to respect and ensure respect for the Geneva Conventions, the Genocide Convention. And as I said, when it comes to genocide, there is an explicit recognition of the obligation, the duty to prevent genocide. So that is something that has been in place since those genocidal statements were made back in October 2023. And if not then, at least since the International Court of Justice ruled in January 2024, which states certainly Israel as a frontline state, which is committing directly these violations against the Palestinian population. I would add the United States. Whether the line for the US at this point is as complicit or whether it's as also committing, I think there could be a question, because the United States has continued to send weapons for use in Gaza month after month. And as experts have put in declarations in court proceedings, but for the US weapon supply, which is billions and billions of dollars that have been sent since October 7th, billions and billions of dollars before October 7th, and the opening of a $4 billion arms stockpile in Israel for its use after October 7th. What we're seeing in genocide could not happen but for US military support. And it's not just military support, it's also political and diplomatic support. But it's not only the US and Israel. As I said, all states have responsibilities, and third states, especially when it comes to provision of arms to Israel, need to take those responsibilities seriously. So you have state responsibility. As we talked about with the ICC, there is also individual responsibility. A place where that could happen is certainly the ICC, but it could also happen in national courts, be it civil or criminal, and that could be for direct liability, complicity, or as Chantal laid out, command responsibility. So I think we could be looking at the Israeli political and military leadership, US political leadership, dual citizens. And this is an area where we are seeing some investigations. Those citizens of the United States, of France, of Belgium, of South Africa, of most countries, frankly, in the world, who have gone and fought as part of the Israeli forces in Gaza, including after the ICJ ruled that there is a plausible genocide, or in the West Bank to enforce a occupation that the International Court of Justice has also declared illegal. So we are starting to see some more dual citizen cases. And then the settlers. The settlement enterprise in and of itself is unlawful, but there has been, over the last at least 10 years, and the last few years especially, a real uptick in settler violence. And this doesn't happen in most cases without the tacit, if not overt, support of Israeli forces backing up settler violence against Palestinians. So we have states, we have individuals, we also have companies. And that could be the arms manufacturers who have been on notice that to continue to provide weapons is complicity in genocide, furthering war crimes, and furthering crimes against humanity. Also, the tech companies, there has been reporting of tech companies using AI to assist Israel in some of its targeting in Gaza under programs like Lavender or Where's Daddy. This is a very, very concerning trend. And then those enforcing the the siege of Gaza. What we're hearing in recent days about the possibility of U.S. contractors giving selective access to food in Gaza. Of course, we all want humanitarian supplies into Gaza. Of course, we all want the Palestinians in Gaza to have food and water, but to have it controlled by US companies for profit under a regime where it is still contributing to either war crimes or crimes against humanity, I think is deeply problematic. And then in the West Bank, we've seen companies maintaining and profiting from the illegality of the occupation and pillage. And there I would really urge listeners to look to El Haq, the Palestinian organization based out of Ramallah, which for a long time has been doing excellent reporting on the profiteering, who's profiting from the occupation. So where do we go? We talked about the ICC. The arrest warrants are out there. The United States has been putting tremendous political pressure on the ICC. There is currently an executive order by Donald Trump that threatens sanctions on the court itself, but so far the only person who's been designated, and I say only in quotes, is the prosecutor of the ICC himself, Karim Khan. So that has led to some states, maybe some within the courts, being very concerned about the Palestine investigation proceeding for fear that somehow it could undermine international law if there is allowed to be accountability for Palestinians. I would encourage instead states and those within the court to say no if the United States and Israel and others are allowed to say no justice for Palestinians at the ICC. It's the international legal order itself that is the victim here. We also have the International Court of Justice, which has been active. There's the South Africa v. Israel case that led to the finding, the first set of provisional measures in January 2024, finding that there was a plausible genocide. That case continues. There was also a case, Nicaragua v. Germany. This turns on that respect and ensuring respect obligation under the Geneva and Genocide Conventions. And this is about the provision of arms and other support for the commission of war crimes. So that decision is out there, and then the advisory opinion. So I think we have places where we have seen enforcement. We will continue to see enforcement and should see far more at the national level, including under universal jurisdiction laws. But there is still not the kind of enforcement to give real protections that this body of law was set up to do.